So today we're going to talk, first Warren will talk about setting yield goals, how to be ambitious with your yield targets, nutrients required per bushel of canola, and then he'll swing it back to me and I'm going to talk about probability of response to fertilization and profitability. So I'll let Warren take it away from here. This is slow to respond.
Thanks, Angela. So that was a really good overview of who we are and what we do at the Canola Council of Canada. But now on to maybe the reason why you came today, more specifically, is how are we going to break that yield barrier that you might have? Well, let's look at, okay, maybe there's...
Put it over there, yeah.
Oh, here we go. So soil conditioning, rip it up, make it black. Let's get that seed bed all ready to go. Maybe some seed dressings are going to put us over the hump. How about some foliar applications in season? Maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 3. Or maybe some growth regulators that might help get us there as well. Maybe there's some other miracle product that you might find at the show today that's gonna do the trick for you, right? Okay, whoa, time out. These are all some options that are out there, and maybe there's some clever marketing around some of it, but it's not necessarily the silver bullet that's gonna get us where we need to be. Not saying that there's no value to some of these options, but keep in mind there really is no silver bullet that's going to be one fix all of our problems for us. So there's a time and a place for everything, not necessarily meaning that we need to do all things all the time. I really like to take a step back and think about more of the basics of what we need to do, or make sure we're taking care of those basics first before we start looking at the next most trendy thing that we can do to try and push those crop yields. So what is a good yield goal? So that's, I think, going to depend on a lot of different factors, right? Everyone's going to have a different comfort level, different fields, different history that's going to help determine what that good yield goal should be. But if we look at what a good fertility plan is, it really does start with looking at that yield target. What are we shooting for? We need to have something that we're striving to achieve in order to make a plan on how we're going to get there, right? So if you think of it as a roadmap, you kind of need to know that end destination before you can come up with the plan on how to get there. For a lot of people, I think there's maybe a little bit of complacency when you start thinking about yield goals or yield targets as well, right? There tends to be that, well, this is what we've always done, so maybe we're gonna stick with that because we know what we're doing, and that's okay. But I think sometimes it does require maybe a bit of a look in the mirror and say, am I really maximizing my potential here? And the other thing to keep in mind too, there's a lot of variability on the farm. So if we've got a yield target, let's just, historically, let's say it's been 45 bushels per acre. So we're always been targeting that 45 bushels per acre, been achieving it on a fairly regular basis as well. That to me means that there's probably some room for bumping that target up a little bit if we're always, or for the most part, always getting there. But not every field on the farm is going to be the same either, right? So rather than having that blanket yield target, we really do need to start focusing more on individual fields, and maybe you could even take it one step further if you're into the precision ag management, even looking at zones within fields, or maybe there's parts of fields that really aren't producing, whether it's salinity or something like that, something that maybe, do we even consider taking some of those regions of the field out of production, and if we can do that, maybe there's our yield gains right there. But at the end of the day, having each individual field have its own yield target is, I think, a strategy that we would want to look at. And the same thing when we're looking at our fertility practices too, not having that one blanket application that's going to be the same rate of the same nutrients across all fields on the farm. Really, when we're talking about yield goals, there's, sometimes maybe we are our yield barrier in that we're not actually, being as aggressive, or maybe not aggressive, as ambitious, use the other A word there. maybe not as ambitious as we could be. And the other thing to keep in mind, so maybe there is that we need to do that self-evaluation, but in some cases there are some limitations that are actually holding us back from achieving those yield targets as well. And, agriculture is a pretty complicated thing, and agronomy is very much so as well. And there's rarely a one thing that's going to get us over that yield hump. It's usually a number of things or a number of factors that are at play that are either holding yield back or that we need to address if we want to get over that barrier that we see. So if we look at maybe more specifically now, so what would your yield goal be? Well, I think that's going to depend where on these fine prairies that your farm is located, right? So we've got, here's in yellow, our canola production regions across the prairies. So, Edmonton's going to have a different yield target than Swift Current, than Brandon, than Winnipeg, right? So there is no one-size-fits-all, but when we do start looking at averages across the prairies, there can be a fairly wide range there. I went on the MASC website and pulled this risk zone map off for Manitoba, and maybe a little hard to see there, but there's some lines that intersect, and I'm sure most of you probably are more familiar with this map than I am, I'm from Saskatchewan. But I just wanted to take a little look at two regions there. So there's the Risk Area 12, which kind of looks like it's in that Red River Valley, and then there was Risk Area 4, which was probably more in that, more situated where we are today in that Brandon area. So just looking at the average yield achieved in these regions in 2018, in that Risk Area 4, we had approximately 44 bushels per acre was the yield, the average yield there. And Risk Area 12 was 50.2 bushels per acre. So definitely we are seeing some differences from one region to another. Now keep in mind, these are average numbers, and an average is made up of high, medium, low numbers. So does it stand to reason that there were higher yields than these average ones? Well, yes, it does. So my thinking is, if there are yields that are higher than the average, why couldn't there be more people hitting those higher numbers rather than the lower? So if you find yourself somewhere in that middle near the average range, maybe there is some room for improvement and looking at maybe a slightly more ambitious yield target on the farm. So when we're setting our yield goals, one of the things we want to keep in mind too, our genetics have improved over the last however many years. I guess it's kind of a continually improving process. If we look at what we were growing for varieties 20 years ago versus what we have today, there's definitely some improvements there. So with that, we've got genetic potential, but have our yield targets been keeping pace with those genetic potentials? And that's a tough question to answer, right? Because maybe in some cases they are, maybe some people aren't, and it's really, it's a challenge to try and do that. So I thought maybe I'd go and look at the canola performance trials and see what that's showing us in terms of yield potentials or what some of the yields being achieved there are. So if you're not familiar, the canola performance trials are a commercial. It's an evaluation once the varieties are registered that takes place all across the prairies. It's funded. You guys are actually a part of it because it's funded through Manitoba Canola Growers Association, Sask Canola, and Alberta Canola. So they're the coordinators of the trial now. So that is actually a useful tool when we're starting to look at evaluation of different varieties. But back to the reason I was talking about it is the average yield. So I did pull for 2018 the average yields in the canola performance trials for Manitoba. So this is all Manitoba now. And also I should mention there's small plot trials and the field scale trials in those in the canola performance trials. So every time we talk about small plots, people say, "Oh yeah, well those are that's way different than farming in a real field." And you're right, it is to a certain extent. But what I do like about it is that it does show the potential of those varieties. So if we look at the small plot for 2018, the average yield there was 15.2 bushels per acre. So again, we looked at the MASC data there a moment ago, and this is definitely higher than any of those averages that we looked at. Also in the field scale trials, we're still looking at approximately 54 bushels per acre. So again, that is higher than some of those other yields that we are seeing being reported on by MASC. So in my mind, I think that means to me that maybe there is, our yields are increasing, our fertility has been increasing. There's nobody that's, probably fertilizing the same as they were 20 years ago, which is a good thing. But maybe there's some opportunity there to even push things a little bit farther as we see some of the yields that are potentially achievable. So trial data is nice because it does give you that bigger overview. But and I'm not a big fan of the coffee shop talk about whose crop yielded what and so on and so forth. But I think there might be a little bit of value there as well. Maybe not the unbelievable stories, but if you look at your area and you want to kind of compare yourself against your counterparts or your fellow farmers. It's kind of a good self-evaluation there, right? To see, if there's somebody who's consistently growing more bushels per acre than you, what are they doing that's different from what you're doing? There might be a reason that they're growing more, and maybe it's worth a cup of coffee and a friendly visit to just see, compare apples to apples and see what the differences are from one practice to another, and try and do some improvement there in terms of, what you could be shooting for and how you'd get there. So let's say now we've determined we've got a really good yield goal in mind, or maybe what we had before was good. Maybe we're going to bump it up a little bit, but we've done that self-evaluation. We're comfortable with what we're shooting for with the yield target now. So what's next? Well, soil testing would be the next logical step, right? We do need to know what we're starting with or what we're working with if we're going to achieve those yields. Now, there's a lot of different variations on soil sampling. It can happen in the fall, it can happen in the spring, it could happen in crop if you're trying to do some diagnostics. There's grid sampling, there's benchmark sampling, the old traditional random across the field sampling. So there's a lot of different things you can do when it comes to soil sampling. My advice is know what you want to get out of it before you start. If you're looking at getting into the precision ag, probably you're going to be working with an advisor who's going to help you with building maps and doing that sampling process, so you know what you want to get out of it when it's all said and done. But at any rate, no matter what level of sophistication you're looking at with soil sampling or what you want to get out of it, it is a necessary component just to know. Number one, are you going to over apply or under apply? If you don't know what you're starting with, you're going into it blind, and that's not a good way to hit those targets. So shifting gears here again a little bit now. So what does it take to grow a canola crop? So I'm sure most of you have seen this graphic before or some variation of it, and it's Liebig's law of the minimum. And really what it's telling us is that it's like the weakest link in the chain. So when it comes to nutrients, your most limiting nutrient is going to determine your yield potential. You can have all the nitrogen in the world, but if your sulfur is limiting, you're not going to achieve your yield target. So it's just something to keep in mind, I guess, is really we want to have that nice balanced approach when it comes to fertility management. So what are the essential nutrients for canola? So canola being a living organism, much like us or any other animal or plant, it does have a wide range of nutrients that it needs in order to be healthy, and different nutrients in different amounts is the other thing to keep in mind. So here's some different nutrients here, and we'll start off with the big ones. So these are they're called major macronutrients. Macro meaning large. So these are the ones we need in large amounts. Not rocket science here for anybody, right? But your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, sulfur generally isn't always considered a macronutrient. But with regards to canola, because it is a high user of sulfur, we do consider it a macronutrient there as well. There's also a number of others, and then we get into the micronutrients. So micro meaning small. These are the ones that are needed in very small amounts, and which is why we typically don't see a need to apply them, because they're supplied through our soil, from our parent material, from the organic matter, mineralization, usually is sufficient enough to supply these nutrients to the plant. So here's one that I do want to spend a little bit of time on. So this is our uptake and removal. So nutrients that are required to grow the plant, and I'm going to focus on the macronutrients here because I think that's where we have the most potential for gains or to influence over the crop. So I've got two lines there across that chart. We've got uptake, so that's the total amount of nutrients that's required to produce 1 bushel of canola. And the second line in red is the removal rate. So as you're harvesting the seed that's leaving the field, how much of those nutrients are you exporting from the field? So it's important to keep both of them in mind. If we look at a long-term sustainable fertility plan, we do want to make sure we're not drawing down our reserves in the field. And that's where those removal rates come into play, so that we're making sure we've got adequate nutrients for into the future. So let's look at nitrogen. So keep in mind, these are a bit of a range in terms of those uptake numbers. There's not it's not 2.734 pounds per bushel. There's a range there. Depending on conditions, you might need a little bit more or a little bit less. But for nitrogen, the number I like to use is about 3 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of canola produced. Now, removal from the field on that is your 1.8, so almost 2 pounds per bushel. Phosphorus is an interesting one. It uses approximately 1.5 pounds of phosphorus to produce a bushel of canola. And removal of phos is quite high as well. So we're looking at removing almost 1 pound of phosphorus per bushel of canola that's produced. So if we were to look at that, we're going to look at these in a second here, but that 52 bushel an acre yield target that we have, if we're hitting that, we're removing, every time we hit that 52 bushels an acre, we're removing almost 50 pounds of phosphorus per acre from that field. So that's an important one to keep in mind when we're thinking long term. Potassium, canola is a really high user of potassium. It's interesting, though, it's a really good scavenger of potassium in the soil. So we're looking at using fairly high rates there. So we've got 2.3 pounds of potassium per bushel, but we're actually not removing that much potassium from the field. So a lot of that's being returned to the field in the form of the straw left behind once after harvest. So we're really actually only removing about 0.5 pound of potassium per bushel produced. And sulfur, again, canola is a fairly high user of sulfur, so we've got our uptake of 0.7 pounds and removal of 3 pounds there. So again, just looking at those, depending on how aggressive your yield target gets, you can get quite a lot of removal from the field. And we do want to make sure we've got that balance so that we're supplying what we need and have the ability to do so into the future. Now, what's the other aspect that's quite important when it comes to crop production? That's the weather, the growing environment, and most importantly, the moisture situation. It's also the one we have the least control over, unfortunately. But a good rule of thumb when it comes to moisture is approximately 4 bushels per acre for each available inch of soil moisture. So that could be starting soil moisture plus whatever your in-season moisture is. So that in-season moisture, that's kind of the wild card, right? Because we can get a pretty good idea going into the year what our soil moisture levels are. It's, how much is it going to rain and when is it going to rain that's really going to determine that. But a question for you. So if you had a dry spring, would you adjust your yield targets based on that? And my answer to that is I don't like to do that because what if it does start raining 2 or 3 weeks after seeding? Now you've kind of started yourself off behind the 8 ball if you went and reduced your fertility plan based on that drier start to the year. You can always come in there and rectify it, top dress it, look after it in season, but it does limit your potential somewhat. Also just wanted to talk about nutrient deficiencies really quickly. Nutrient deficiencies can show up a number of ways. Not always just because you haven't applied enough nutrients to the field. There could be other factors that are limiting the plant's ability to take up those nutrients from the field. So something like, if you've got mobile nutrients in the soil, you get rain, you get a lighter soil texture, you could leach those nutrients out of the root zone and show a temporary nutrient deficiency because of that. Anything that's restricting root growth, such as a hard pan layer that the roots can't penetrate to get to more nutrients, that can also show up as nutrient deficiencies, or even drought conditions can limit the uptake of some of these. looking at different parts of the plant, some nutrients are mobile in the plant and some aren't. So when we're talking about nutrients that are mobile, that would be things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And that's why nutrient deficiencies of those nutrients is going to show up on those older leaves, because the plant's kind of cannibalizing itself and moving those nutrients up to the growing point in the young tissue. Whereas something like sulfur or boron, that could show up on the newest growth because there's the plant isn't mobilizing that and sending it there. So when you're seeing some of these symptoms, it's important just to look and see what the cause is. I'd probably kick myself if I didn't mention this before I left today as well. So the 4R nutrient stewardship is an important process for us. It really, the 4Rs, you've probably heard these as well numerous times hopefully, but the right source at the right rate at the right time in the right place. And working with a designated advisor, crop advisor, or retailer is important in order for us to be able to track this program and demonstrate to the public and to our consumers and environmentally that what we are doing on farm is sustainable and is a healthy practice for us. So I talked a lot about fertility and how to, things we want to consider with regards to fertility, but I think it's also important to remember that if we don't look after everything, we can have the best fertility program in the world, but if something's missing in the other part of the agronomy, maybe it's disease or weed management or something else, we're not going to achieve that yield potential either, right? So it is a full package that we do need to consider. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Angela for looking at some returns on investment.
Okay, right on. Thanks, Warren. There's a trick to this clicker. I don't know what exactly. Maybe this. I'm not sure. Over at you? Okay. So Warren talked about what does our canola crop need. I'm going to talk about what is a probable response to increasing fertility. I'm going to focus quite a bit on nitrogen and talk about our ultimate canola challenge as something that we did in small plot and then took it into farmers' fields looking at large plot with farmers' equipment, with their practices in randomized replicated trials. And then I'll talk about boron for our micros and probability of response to boron. Are you sure? Okay, response to nitrogen. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Most of our annual crops respond significantly to added nitrogen. This is looking at hybrid canola specifically and the most recent yield data and response to added nitrogen. So the numbers aren't super important, but what you're looking at is yield on the y-axis, soil and fertilizer N on the x-axis, and you can see when we start with nothing, we have a pretty steep increase as we start adding nitrogen, and then it starts to plateau, and there's always going to be a point of diminishing returns. But with hybrid canola, we see a pretty significant response, even when we're getting up to higher rates. The top peak of this curve is 180 pounds, and you can see it's starting to go sideways. So it's not necessarily going to come back down and see a yield decline, but it's going to start to diminish where you're not seeing as much of an improvement as you add more beyond that. So the Ultimate Canola Challenge we did in 2016 and 2017 looked at farmers' base rate of nitrogen. So it was different depending on the farm that we worked with, whatever they were doing. And then the only thing we varied was to go 25% more N. And so we had 17 sites across the prairies, actually mostly situated in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and we measured the yield difference with that additional nitrogen. So the blue bar is their base rate, the red bar is the top-up rate, and the yield corresponding with those rates. If it's got a star above it, it means that statistically there is a significant difference in yield response to that added nitrogen. But that's a little bit confusing, so I'll just kind of spell out what that was telling us. So we had 8 of the 17 sites that had a significant or statistically significant yield increase to the 25% additional nitrogen. On average of all of those trials, we had a 2.2 bushel per acre yield increase. The yield range in all the trials was between 34 bushels an acre and 67. The average yield of our low rate, or the base rate nitrogen, it wasn't low, but base rate nitrogen was 54 bushels per acre. The average yield of our treatment increase was 56 bushels per acre. The nitrogen rate range in all of these trials ranged from the lowest of 70 pounds of actual N. The highest was 250 pounds of actual N. So when I saw these trials and I saw the base rates that a lot of the producers were applying, I'm like, this is insane. And we will never see a response to added nitrogen. And then when we were starting to see a response, I'm like, yeah, but it can't be profitable. There's no way. And so I argued and I argued and argued, and the stats just don't lie. So I'll show you, and we'll get into the profitability a little bit later. But I think really what is telling for me from this data is that even with really high base rates, and even with the highest base rate in this trial of 178 pounds, there was a statistical yield improvement with a 25% increase in N. Kind of blows my mind a little bit, but there was, and it just shows us the yield potential of the hybrid canola we grow today. Average nitrogen rates, I don't know if I said this, 127 for the base rate, 158 for the treatment increase rate. Okay, so that's nitrogen. Like I said, I'll get back to the profitability here in a minute. What about phosphorus? So what this graph is showing is probability of response to 15 pounds of P2O5 or actual phosphorus with different soil test levels. This is modified Kelowna. We use Olsen in Manitoba, but the trend is the same. So basically what it's showing is at different soil test levels from low to high, what is the probability of response to 15 pounds? That's not very much phosphorus. And you can see when we have low soil test levels, less than 10 ppm, we have almost 100% chance of response to 15 pounds of P2O5. When we start moving down the graph and get to over 30 ppm of residual P2O5 or phosphorus, we now are at the level of 50 to 75% chance of response to an application of 15 pounds. Still a pretty high chance of response. But that's a low rate of phosphorus. So what if we get beyond this? Traditionally, the research would tell us probably not much chance of response once we start going beyond the starter rates of phosphorus. But there's been some interesting recent work. Burgo's done quite a bit of work, and actually it's public. You can find it on their website. In our most recent science edition of Canola Digest, we had some work that looked at really aggressive rates of phosphorus. So now we're talking 80 to 100 pounds of actual P. And they're seeing some pretty impressive yield responses to those high rates of phosphorus fertilization. So I kind of wonder, maybe we are limiting our crop yields by not trying to push those phosphorus rates a little bit. If you're testing this on your own farm and you're going to rates that high, you have to remember that you're adding additional nitrogen. So if you really want to test it, you need to make sure you increase your nitrogen on the comparison trial. Response to potassium. As Warren said, canola uses a lot, but that doesn't mean you need to supply it. Very, very low chance of response to potassium. We have a lot of supply of potassium on most of our soils in Manitoba. If you're going to see a response, the highest chance of response is if you're in a really low residual level of potassium. So less than 150 pounds, and we're talking 0 to 6 inches. You don't need to look at lower than that. If you're less than 150 pounds or 75 ppm, maybe not a huge chance of response. If you're less than 100 pounds or 50 ppm, you're starting to get in the area of a better chance of response. Not really, really likely, but a better chance. And at that level, you certainly want to be thinking about replenishing your soil with potassium and stopping kind of mining it. If you have soil test or soil residual levels of potassium over 300 pounds in the 0 to 6 or over 150 ppm, the chance of response to added potassium is almost zero. What is apparently the third most limiting macronutrient? That is sulfur, and there's very high likelihood of response to the first 10 to 20 pounds of sulfate fertilizer. Sulfate fertilizer being ATS liquid sulfur or ammonium sulfate. What about beyond that? Beyond that 10 to 20 pounds, that's not super aggressive. So this is looking at 13 pounds is the blue, 27 pounds is of actual is the red. And what we're looking at is the yield increase from 0. So pretty substantial yield increase even with only 13 pounds, over 15 bushel per acre yield increase when it's applied pre-seed. At 27 pounds applied pre-seed, over a 20 bushel per acre yield increase to that application. So 27 pounds of sulfur is much more than the average Manitoba producer applies. I think the MASC data was showing maybe 11 to 15 pounds average application of sulfur. So maybe we are, again, shorting our canola of sulfur a little bit. So that's our macros. What about our micros? As Warren said, they are critical to our canola's growth, development, and yield. They're just required in very, very small amounts. So if we look at what nitrogen uses, and as Warren said, 3 pounds per bushel, what is boron? What's the requirement of boron? Approximately 0.006 pounds per bushel. So it needs it, absolutely, and without it, there'd be an issue, but it just needs it in very, very small amounts. What is the likelihood of response to boron? Low. Pretty, I think just simply it's unlikely. Even when the soil supply is considered low. There is some inconclusive results that show maybe we can recover yield or maintain yield with a foliar application of boron if we are experiencing some stress at flowering, high heat at flowering. But like I said, fairly inconclusive. Where we might have a greater chance of response to boron is sandy, low organic matter, high pH. So I said even when the soil supply is considered low, we have not a strong relationship to application of boron. This is, Regis Karamanos talks about this quite a bit, and this is something that he summarized looking at the probability of response with different soil residual levels of boron with the hot water extractable B method. So the bottom's showing the ppm, and a range from 0 to 4, so 4 being very, very high, and the yield relationship was all over the place. So basically saying he could not find a relationship between hot water extractable B and applied B. So we're just not there yet. Maybe we just don't really know what the critical level of boron is, or we don't have the right extraction method. I don't know. But we just can't find a relationship. So if someone tells you, look at this B level on your soil test, you need to apply B, I would have some questions for them about that. So we did our UCC on boron as well in field scale trials. And we found none of the sites had a statistically significant yield increase to a foliar application of boron. And that is consistent with a lot of work that's been done on this product. Okay, so that's all good. We can have responses to things, but does it pay? And so this was my argument after I lost the argument about, we're not going to see a yield increase to 25% increase of N with those really high rates. And then we did, and I said, yeah, but there's no way that it pays. I don't believe that it would possibly pay. So let's look at, does it pay? Because, at the end of the day, that's kind of the most important thing, right? So how do we determine if more would be profitable? First, we need to determine if it's limiting. If it's not limiting, then it's not going to be profitable. So I would encourage you all to try incremental increases without varying anything else. So the Ultimate Canola Challenge I was talking about, we do have a protocol online that you can follow this and try on your own farm to figure out, maybe are you shorting your crop of something, or could you get more with more? And as I mentioned, there's always going to be a point of diminishing returns, so it's kind of trying to find that point for your own farm's dollars and cents. Okay, so one way to look at profitability is dollars earned per dollars spent, or maybe that's the only way to look at profitability. And this idea of the maximum economic return. So the maximum economic return is when the last dollar you spend returns a dollar. Where should you set your own economic return really depends on your aversion to risk, or what things are looking like. So maybe markets are really good, you want to be more aggressive. Markets are bad, you want to be less aggressive. So with nitrogen in particular, where do you want to set this economic return? A dollar spent to return $2. That's a pretty risk-averse look at this. As you start getting lower, it becomes riskier and riskier. Manitoba Ag has a really good nitrogen calculator, and it lets you look at nitrogen and applications in a lot of different ways. But they do it in this way as well, looking at this maximum economic return. So basically, you can vary everything. You can put in there your cost of nitrogen, the type of nitrogen that you're using. You can put in the cost of, or the price of your canola, and how you want to change that price of your canola to kind of do some budgeting based on low and high. And then it'll spit this out for you. So this is all based on yield data and trials, and theoretical yield increases with each 10-pound increment or increase in nitrogen. So if we just look at an example of 1050, I think right now we can probably lock in 1050 for new crop canola. So let's start there. We're talking 50 cents, basically a pound for urea. And if we go to a current N rate of 110 pounds of actual N, our marginal revenue is $2.06. If we continue to increase that to 140 pounds, we're now at the last dollar spent on nitrogen yields us $1.42 in return. So in this calculator, it defaults to anything in green is where your last dollar spent on nitrogen will return you $1.25 to $1.50. And that's kind of where Manitoba Ag suggests that we set as a good starting point for a return on nitrogen. So what did that look like in the UCC? These are all the statistically significant trials. And what you're seeing is their base rate of nitrogen versus their increase. So that's what these numbers are here from 0 to 250. And their marginal return and the yield increase that they had. So we had a range from a return of negative $1.34. So negative $1.34 for the last dollar spent on nitrogen. It's obviously not profitable, right? We had 86 cents return for the last dollar spent on nitrogen, not profitable. But we had some pretty big numbers, $5.25 return to that grower for the last dollar he spent on nitrogen. Not surprising that that corresponds to the lowest nitrogen base rate. But even with these high rates, I was pretty surprised to see the return for the last dollar spent on nitrogen. So, rates over 200, they had $1.62 return to them for the last dollar spent on nitrogen, over 3 bushels per acre yield increase. So I just wanted to pull out a couple examples from this UCC to take a closer look. So St. Pierre, their base rate was 135 pounds. That base rate yielded an average of about 50.5 bushels per acre. Their treatment rate was just shy of 170 pounds of actual N, yielded 52 bushels per acre for a 1.4 bushel per acre yield improvement. They had a residual of 50 pounds of N in the 0 to 24, 5.5% organic matter. So I would suggest on your own farm you take a look at this nitrogen use per bushel that Warren was talking about. And in this particular case in St. Pierre, I accounted for the residual N, but I did not account for the organic matter. Obviously, we're getting mineralization. I just don't know how much, and it's really hard to say. So I didn't account for it in this nitrogen use equation. So with our residual N and our base rate, this particular trial had a nitrogen use efficiency, if you want to call it that, of 3.66 pounds of N per bushel. Reasonable. Maybe high end of reasonable, but definitely reasonable. The treatment rate, 219 total pounds of N for 52 bushels, had a nitrogen use efficiency of 4.22 pounds of N applied per bushel produced. Starting to get a little high. Not surprising that when we start being aggressive with nitrogen and really increasing, that our efficiency starts to drop a bit. So in this stupid clicker. Okay. Has a mind of its own, this clicker. So the marginal cost in the St. Pierre example, I used 50 cents a pound, was $17. Their marginal return, $14.70. They were losing money. If you do this across your entire farm, you're losing $2.30 an acre. Maybe you won't even notice, but it's something for sure. Marginal revenue of 86 cents per last dollar spent on nitrogen. The Brandon example in 2016, this was just south of Brandon here at one of the Williamsons. Their base rate was 119 pounds to yield 62 bushels per acre. Treatment rate, 150 pounds to yield over 65 bushels per acre for a 3.4 bushel per acre yield improvement. Again, statistically significant. They had a residual N of 15 pounds, 4% organic matter. Their nitrogen use efficiency was pretty good. 2.16 pounds of N per bushel on the base rate, 2.5 pounds per bushel on the treatment rate. If you're seeing that, I think you should feel pretty comfortable that you're in a fairly efficient system. They had a marginal cost of $15 per acre for that treatment increase, with a marginal return of $35.60. So a pretty impressive profit. Wait, my math looks wrong there. Oh no, it's right. Yeah, a pretty impressive profit of $20.60 per acre, a marginal revenue of $2.42 for the last dollar spent on nitrogen. If this is what it would always look like, we would all do this all the time. But I caution a little bit. When we're looking at trial areas, for good reason, we're always looking for the best areas of the field. We need to find areas of the field that are uniform, well-drained, so that we can be sure when we see a response that it's because of the treatment and not because we got a saline area or, poor drainage here or whatever it is. In my experience, trial areas tend to yield, just generally, without considering treatments at all, 5 to even 10% higher than the rest of the field. So I think we need to be a little bit careful with these things and just broadly applying it across the field. And I would suggest that when we're getting into nitrogen rates of 150, 200 pounds of actual N, it becomes a little bit scarier to have blanket applications of that. And maybe more important or emphasizes the importance of variable rate a little bit more than, when we were normally sitting at 90 to 110 pounds of nitrogen. Because what is the point of, your eroded hilltops, your saline areas of the field, what's the point of putting 170 pounds of nitrogen in those areas if they just simply won't respond to it? And that brings me into sustainability. Obviously, more production off the same unit of acres is a very good thing for sustainability. We're sequestering more carbon, so it's good, good for the environment. It's a good thing. It's good for your bottom line. But we need to be a little bit careful, and we need to assess nitrogen use efficiency, and we need to understand that we might get the finger pointed at us a little bit more if we start to really be aggressive with these N rates, and people might start putting the magnifying glass a little bit more on what we're doing. So again, I would encourage you to look at what is your nitrogen use efficiency on your farm. How are you applying it? Are you following for our stewardship? In the UCC, the average, or the range, sorry, of nitrogen use efficiency was on the low end 1.35 pounds of N applied per bushel. On the high end, 5.4 pounds of N applied per bushel produced. So some people who maybe aren't in the industry might look at this and say, well, the 1.35 sounds really efficient. That sounds good for the environment. It sounds good for sustainability. The 5.4 sounds really bad. But on the low end, I suspect that we have a lot of unrealized yield potential. We can get really, really good nitrogen use efficiency if we follow, for instance, if we just mine our organic matter and mine our residual N, and that is not obviously what we want to do. On the high end, though, I think we're getting sloppy. I suspect that when we start getting to levels like that, nitrogen is maybe no longer the limiting factor, and we need to start looking at other things other than nitrogen. So we need to be really careful as we apply more and more rates, or higher and higher rates of nitrogen. Our potential for losses gets higher. So I think it's always important that we look at this, but it's going to become increasingly important that we're addressing these factors for losses, maybe considering stabilizers. So there's been a lot more attention on this leaky pipe phenomenon, where we're seeing nitrous oxide losses, a pretty potent greenhouse gas. We obviously know that we have ammonia losses through volatilization, and we need to be cognizant of both of those things. To summarize here, I think what's most important to me to get across from these Ultimate Canola Challenge and from looking at pushing your fertilizer is that yield really isn't everything. Well, 5 of the 8 significants had a positive net return. 3 of them had a significant yield difference with 25% increase of N. So a difference in yield with that treatment, but they were less profitable than the base rate. So it's easy to report to our neighbors and talk about these big yields, but we really need to make sure for our own farm that it's actually profitable and it makes sense. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to flip through this. This was a engage the audience little quiz for you, but you can take a look. And I want to flip through that because I want to promote this event that I'm planning for March in Brandon. This is a follow-up to our 2019 Combine College that we hosted at the Keystone Center. March 25th, you can find out more information about this at Manitoba Canola Growers booth. We are obviously, it's called Seeding and Spraying College. It should be fairly self-explanatory. We're looking at the seeding and spraying operations. We'll have equipment on site and 12 agronomic breakout sessions. Tom Wolfe with Agrometrics will be there as a keynote speaker talking about sprayer efficiencies. So with that, again, I want to thank you all for coming and thank Manitoba Canola Growers.
Great. Thank you so much, Ange. Thank you, Warren. We have just a couple of minutes for questions. So is there anyone with a burning question who can shout real loud and we'll repeat the question? John, I'm not going to know all your names. That was just luck.
The question that John asked was the 25% increase of nitrogen, how did that extend days of maturity? I don't know. We don't have all of those numbers, but what I can tell you is they were all harvested on the same day. So as far as like looking really, really close at the moisture contents, I don't have those numbers. It's a very good question, though. And something you would need to think about. Did you hear his question?
So the question was, what nutrients are left in canola straw? So if you remember that uptake and removal chart that I had there, anything that's not removed from the field is what's going to be left there. So you can figure it out, I guess, but off the top of my head, I don't have exact numbers for that. But anything that's not removed, so say you've taken up 3 pounds of nitrogen and you've removed 1.8 of them, so for every bushel, you would still have approximately a pound of nitrogen in that straw.
Great. Well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you both. There will be some of the Council Agronomy team at the Manitoba Canola Growers and Canola Council booth. It's booth 1113, just up and around the corner here at the top of the arena, if you want to join them. So I've got a little token of thanks for Angela and Warren for joining us this morning. Please help me in thanking them this morning.